I have often said that we cannot change history, but history can and has changed us. The Holocaust can never be challenged as a historical fact or denied other than by those who seek to forget and blur this greatest crime against humanity. The heroic survivors of the Holocaust can never forget, nor can we, and the perpetrators never forgiven. This history has a distinct clarity, and it is this clarity that has enabled the Jewish people, the Israeli people, and Germans to contend with this unprecedented human tragedy. Where there is no clarity, there will be no reconciliation and no healing. When confronted by a crime against humanity so hideous and overwhelming, it is virtually impossible to conceive what could be the appropriate punishment for the killing, not of one person, but for the killing of millions. Even in biblical terms, an eye for an eye cannot in any moral sense be used or transformed by saying a people for a people. A crime of such magnitude can only be perpetrated in the absence of active resistance and occur given a broad level of compliance by the population as a whole. But in this massive darkness, even one voice of dissension and opposition can, as the poet and singer Leonard Cohen said, be a small crack through which the light could come through and ultimately shatter that evil. Standing here today in Sachsenhausen, in this place, you can see the very symbols of evil, and you can see them shattered by the light. The light did prevail. But though this evil was shattered, it is still a day in which the collective consciousness of humanity should converge and ask how the genocide of 6 million Jewish people could have happened in the heart of civilized Europe, and how can we be certain that the phrase "never again" becomes part of our reality. These are not merely words, particularly when people still openly demonstrate their nostalgia for the Nazi period and National Socialism. These words "never again" became a political imperative anywhere, but particularly in Germany. The words "never again" are a call to everyday action to ensure that the scourge of anti-Semitism, notions of racial superiority, xenophobia, and hatred of the other never again plague the societies in which we live. This is not only about the past, it is about today and the future of all of our children. Over the last year in particular, I've had the privilege to meet a number of survivors that are still with us today. I've never met such courage, conviction, inspiration, and determination to continue to live and tell their story, especially to the younger generation, about their experiences. These survivors are proof as to how the lowest depravity and cruelty the world has known can be overcome and countered with the most profound courage and sense of morality. These precious survivors will always remain a beacon of hope, of what is right and just. That is the reason that this is not only a story of Holocaust and genocide, it is also a story of incredible heroism and fortitude, and this too must never be forgotten. In this year, since COVID has become such a massive disruption to our societies, please remember the Holocaust survivors. They are still with us, and help them, please, contend with this unprecedented distancing, loneliness, and sometimes solitude. It is our highest duty. Ultimately, the relations that have developed over the years between the State of Israel and Germany will never be normal or simple. They will evoke at one and the same time feelings of anguish, guilt, inspiration, and hope. None of these emotions can be swept aside, but that does not mean that we should remain the victims of our history. I have heard the survivors say that we speak for the victims, but we are not victims ourselves. Indeed, they have shown us how they, with such integrity and courage, can overcome and prevail over that history. To commemorate this day in Israel is never easy. To do so in Germany, especially here in Sachsenhausen, is even harder. As you hear the sirens in Israel, and as life in those few minutes comes to a complete halt, drowned in silence, you can see before your own eyes the answer to the Shoah. The Israeli flag, Israeli soldiers, and Israeli men, women and children charged with the sacred task of ensuring that this graven attempt to kill the Jewish people will never, but never happen again and will never succeed. Yehi Zechram Baruch.
At Sachsenhausen concentration camp memorial, and Sachsenhausen concentration camp was one of several huge Nazi concentration camps on the territory of the German Reich. It was built in 1936 already. This was long before the war, and as such, it was not a primarily site of the Holocaust perpetration. Sachsenhausen, camps like Sachsenhausen, rather aimed in something that Heinrich Himmler called extermination by work. The Nazis exploited the workforce of the prisoners so long until the prisoner died. And we're standing here in front of the entrance gate of Sachsenhausen concentration camp, and it has this like a motto: work liberates you, Arbeit macht frei, which was of course very cynical and very untrue.
And this is the original?
This is not the original gate, no. But when the camp was liberated, one of the first things the surviving prisoners who were still here did is to break it out.
Yeah.
They didn't want to see it anymore. So it was reconstructed later when the memorial was opened. Over 200,000 people from all over Europe were imprisoned at Sachsenhausen concentration camp. In April 1945, the camp was liberated by the Red Army, but the SS had previously driven the vast majority of the prisoners on a death march towards the north. The prisoners on the death march were only liberated in May 1945, quite close to the Baltic Sea, by American and Soviet troops. And now I would invite you to walk over to the so-called small camp, which was the area where the Jewish prisoners were housed in at Sachsenhausen. More than 200,000 prisoners were passed through Sachsenhausen concentration camp in the time of its existence, and about 20% of these prisoners had a Jewish background. The first years of Sachsenhausen, the number of Jewish prisoners was relatively small, but it rose a lot during a mass arresting campaign after the so-called Crystal Night, the November pogrom, when the SS arrested Jewish men all over the German Reich in order to escalate dramatically the pressure on the Jewish population to emigrate. From all northern Germany, they were brought to Sachsenhausen. From southern Germany, they were brought to Dachau. And from the middle, they were brought to Buchenwald. To all these 3 camps. And in Sachsenhausen, there were more than 6,300 Jewish men. We are in one of the barracks of the small camp here now. It was a part of Sachsenhausen concentration camp, which was relatively small and which was separated from the rest of the camp. These men have been arrested mainly because of their political beliefs. They were social democrats, communists. Some of them were so-called criminals, Jews who had disobeyed the anti-Semitic laws in Germany. And so they were registered as political prisoners and Jewish prisoners.
Already in 1936.
Yeah, but they were registered like all the others. They were not to be distincted by their prisoners' registration. But the SS, of course, knew that these people were Jewish. So from the very beginning, the SS treated these men much worse than any other prisoner. I have a testimony of a survivor of Sachsenhausen of this time, and he said all camp inmates were labeled with a number and a mark. So he remembered later a triangular symbol of a particular color. We, the Jews from the November campaign, received, along with a number, a red and a yellow symbol, 2 triangles, to be sewn crosswise on top of each other, eventually as a symbol of our political and also racial inferiority and untrustworthiness. And this is why already in 1938, all the prisoners in the camp language, in the camp lingo, called it the Jewish barracks here. So you see beds here, 3-layered beds, but when the Jewish prisoners were brought here after the November pogrom, they were stacking 400 prisoners in half of a barrack. And in order to get so many people in, they took out all the furniture, and we do have many testimonies of survivors who tell that the floor was covered with straw, and there was a pile of blankets in the corner, and so they had to kind of build their beds like a fish in a tin next to each other on the floor in this big room. There were no beds, there were no tables, there were of course no lockers. These furniture have been brought in order to show how concentration camp prisoners lived in general. But this does not apply for the Jewish prisoners. Jewish prisoners always had the hardest fate, and the SS treated them much worse. So if other prisoners were laying in 3-story beds, the Jewish prisoners were laying on the floor. And this sign up here was also in the time of the GDR saying housing in 250 prisoners, but this did not apply for the Jewish blocks.
And this single bed here has any meaning? Or?
The single bed has a meaning. There was the so-called capo. The capo was usually a criminal prisoner who was put a prisoner, but he was put to be the boss of a barrack. And he had a single bed, he had much better conditions. And the Nazis on the Jewish blocks, they usually put a very anti-Semitic German criminal capo. And he was the boss of the barrack. While everybody had to go to work and work hard physical labor, this guy stayed here, cleaned up a bit the barracks, wrote his how many prisoners that everybody was there, and prepared everything when the other prisoners would come back at night.
Something which I've noticed, it seems here that there is some damage inside to the barracks. I'm not sure if it's because of age or...
What you see here is actually the result of a big fire. There was an arsonist attack put on this barrack by young neo-Nazis. Isaac Rabin visited Sachsenhausen, the Prime Minister of Israel. He visited Sachsenhausen in 1992, and it was all on the press, and he of course visited this place as the barrack of where the Jewish prisoners always were. And it was on the press, and even these neo-Nazis learned about it. And a few nights later, two young boys, young men came in, and they set this barrack on fire. The backside part of the barrack burned down to the foundation, and this part was heavily damaged, and you can still see from the heat that this color from the ceiling has come off. These two young neo-Nazis were caught by the police, and they had to be judged by juvenile law because they were not yet 21. Mm-hmm. And in the trial, they were doing the, we didn't know what we were doing. They appeared like they were innocent, so stupid that you would also, you almost pitied them. But today, one of them is the head of the neo-Nazi party in Barnim. So it was from the very beginning anti-Semitic motives, and they managed to mislead the judge and jury. They were not judged for this political crime they had committed.
Yizkor prayer in memory of the 6 million Jews who perished during the Holocaust. יזכור אלוהים את כל הנשמות של כל קהילות בית ישראל בגולת אירופה שהועלו על מוקד בשנות השואה תש"ה. 6 מיליון אנשים ונשים, ילדים וילדות, בחורים ובתולות, זקן וטף, שנהרגו ושנטבחו באכזריות איומה ונרצחו ברצח המונים במקומות מגוריהם בערים ובעיירות ובכפרים, ויתרם הובלו למחנות הריכוז ונספו במיתות משונות ונוראות ונשרפו לאפר בכבשני האש של מחנות ההשמדה האיומים בגרמניה ובפולין ובשאר ארצות בידי עם המרצחים הגרמני עם עוזריו הרוצחים משאר העמים שהיו בעצה אחת להשמיד ולהרוג ולאבד את העם היהודי ולמחות את זכר היהדות ולכלות כל אשר בשם ישראל יקרא. אל נקמות שופט הארץ, זכור נא את נחלי הדם שנשפך כמים, דמי אבות ובנים, אמהות ועולליהן, רבנן ותלמידיהם, והשב גמול שבעתיים לצוררי עמך. שבעת שמע ישראל שזעקו הלקוחים למוות, אל תדום, וענקת המעונים תעלה לפני כיסא כבודך, לנקום במהרה בימינו לעינינו, את נקמת דם בניך ובנותיך, הקדושים והטהורים, שלא זכו לקבר ישראל, ככתוב, כי דם עבדיו יקום ונקם, ישיב לצריו וכיפר אדמתו עמו. אמן. So what exactly are we seeing here on the ground? There are different gravels I see. And
this is the shoe testing track. The SS was using prisoners as forced laborers for many purposes. And one purpose was, it was an economy that were doing leather substitutes. So they wanted to produce substitute material to put soles under shoes because they needed leather soles for boots for the army and for the militaries and for the civilians. And different German companies were producing artificial leather, and now was the question which one works best. So they were doing a properly scientific experiment, taking several pairs of shoes, putting all the different samples and distributing the shoes and having people walking around this circular all day. The problem only was ethical. It was prisoners. prisoners who had to walk here all day, and they were hungry. They were the SS was speeding them up with violence, and in the evening the shoes were taken from them, and the shoe industry people compared which was the better material. And the thing is that all this bosses from these companies, they came to the camp, they watched these experiments here, so they knew all about it. And when you're standing here and you imagine that all the barracks are around here, when you come here in order to see these tests on the shoe testing track, you also see what happens in the camp. These prisoners of the shoe testing detail, they were also misused for medical experiments. Nazi doctors were testing amphetamines. Pervitin, which is a performance-enhancing drug with the prisoners. They were given these drugs, and then the Nazi doctors watched how many hours do they walk on this shoe testing track without a break.
So this is the original fence, or?
No, it's not the original fence anymore. The camp has been liberated 76 years ago. So this is something that has been reconstructed. But it shows, it's to demonstrate the system of fences here. You first have like a gravel field where the prisoners were not allowed to step on. The sign says neutral zone. It was called neutral zone. It will be shot without warning immediately if someone stepped on this gravel. And then you have a barbed wire, a fence which was loaded with electricity, an electrified fence. And behind it there is like a gangway, and then comes the wall. And in the gangway between the wall and the fences, guards and dogs were patrolling. This shows that it was completely impossible to flee from inside here. If prisoners managed to flee, it was just from outside working details, where they would leave the camp with guards, and there sometimes prisoners managed to flee, but usually they didn't get very far because they were easily recognizable. I want to tell you the story of a Jewish uprising now. In October 1942, Himmler ordered that all the Jewish prisoners from all the concentration camps within Germany should be transported to Auschwitz, because he wanted Germany to be free of all Jewish people, how he called it, Judenrein, exactly, even the concentration camps. So also in Sachsenhausen, preparations were made to bring all the Jewish prisoners to Auschwitz. And 18 young men who had heard about it, they stormed to the roll call area. They were shouting and they were attacking SS men, and their act of despair, it went down to the annals of Sachsenhausen. It is very famous among the prisoners as the uprising of the 18. And this act of despair actually was not punished. It was surprisingly for everybody that they were not separately punished, but on the next day the SS brought all the prisoners, the Jewish prisoners of Sachsenhausen, and also these brave young 18 men to Auschwitz. And only very few of these people survived National Socialism in the end.
You know, it's interesting because the number 18 in Judaism is very symbolic.
Yeah.
It is a number of luck. I don't think in this case that their fate was very lucky, but it's interesting because it is symbolic.
Yeah.
And it's also interesting that we or at least I haven't heard the story of this uprising here. There are very few stories that are known about uprisings in concentration camps, and I've never heard this, so thank you for sharing that.
After the Jewish prisoners were sent to Auschwitz in October of 1942. For the next almost 2 years, there were hardly any Jewish prisoners in Sachsenhausen. It was a time with nearly no Jewish prisoners. Until in connection with the evacuation of Auschwitz from summer 1944 on, again, transports with thousands of Jewish prisoners were brought to Sachsenhausen. And now, not just men, like up to then, all the prisoners of Sachsenhausen were male. But now, on a large scale, also women and children. And they were housed mainly not here in the main camp, but satellite camps were founded, like in Glöwen, Schwarzheide, Liberose, and these were satellite camps with only for Jewish prisoners, and the living conditions there, they were terrible. They were much worse than everywhere else. Thousands of Jewish inmates died of hunger and of weakness, both in the camp and on the death march. And until the very end, the SS killed deliberately these Jewish men. And one example is when they evacuated it was not an evacuation, one was rather a cleansing of this satellite camp at Liberose. 1,300 Jewish men were shot. They were deemed not to be able to stand the death march, which was expected, that they would walk from Liberose to the main camp in Sachsenhausen. And they shot 1,300 men here at Sachsenhausen.
In general, how many people were killed here in Sachsenhausen?
We cannot say it exactly because many documents have been destroyed, but it's around 50,000. And 10,000 at least are Jewish victims among them.
יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה, ועל מה דיברה חירותי והמלך מלכותי ויצמח פורקני ויקרב משיחי, בחייכונו וימכונו וחיי תכל בית ישראל בעגלה ובזמן קריב ואמרו אמן. יהי שמי רבה מבורך לעולם ולמלמי עלמיה. יתברך ישתבח יתפאר ויתרומם יתנשא ותדר ותלה ותלל שמי דקודשה ברכו. לעילה מן כל ברכתה שירתה תשפחתה ונחמתה דאמירם בעלמה ואמרו אמן. יהי שלם רבה מן שמיים וחיים טובים עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן. עשה שלום במרומיו, הוא ברחמיו יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל ואמרו אמן.